The courtroom was silent. You could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. All eyes were on the man standing at the front, dressed in a dark blue uniform, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Officer Richard Doyle, a seasoned cop with nearly 20 years on the force. And he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. "Do you even know who I am?" he sneered, crossing his arms as he glared at the woman sitting high above him. His voice was thick with arrogance, filled with the confidence of a man who had gotten away with too much for too long. Judge Olivia Carter stared down at him, her expression unreadable. She was a tall, regal black woman in her late 40s, her braided hair pulled into a neat bun. She had spent her life fighting for justice, and today was no different. Officer Doyle smirked, his blue eyes flashing with contempt. He had been pulled into the courtroom for a misconduct hearing, accused of harassing and wrongfully arresting a young black man. But he wasn't worried. He had been in these situations before, and they always ended the same way. "The only reason I'm even here is because people like you want to make everything about race," Doyle continued, his voice dripping with mockery. He leaned forward on the defendant's table, speaking as if the judge was beneath him. "You people always think you're the victim." Gasps echoed across the courtroom. The tension in the air was suffocating. Judge Carter narrowed her eyes. The bailiff, a heavy-set black man named Marcus, clenched his fists. Even the stenographer paused for a split second, her fingers hovering over the keys. Olivia had heard it all before. She had spent years dealing with men like Doyle, arrogant, racist, untouchable. But today was different. A slow, cold smile spread across her lips. "Officer Doyle," she said, her voice calm but deadly, "I suggest you choose your next words very carefully." But Doyle wasn't the type to take warnings. He let out a dry chuckle and shook his head. "Lady, you might have that robe and that little hammer, but you ain't nothing to me." Silence. A deadly silence. And then, bam! Judge Carter slammed her gavel down with such force that the sound echoed like a gunshot. The courtroom jolted. "I have had enough," she declared, standing up so quickly that her chair scraped against the floor. "Officer Doyle, you are in contempt of court. Bailiff, take him into custody." Doyle's smug expression flickered with surprise, but it was too late. Before he could react, Marcus was already behind him, grabbing his arms and forcing them behind his back. "Wait, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Doyle growled, struggling against the bailiff's grip. Judge Carter leaned forward, her dark eyes burning with intensity. "You just disrespected a sitting judge in open court," she said, her voice dangerously low. "Let's see if your badge can save you now." Doyle's face drained of color as the reality of the situation hit him. And then, just as Marcus clicked the handcuffs around his wrists, the doors to the courtroom burst open. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a black suit stormed inside, his expression tense. "Judge Carter, wait," he called out. All heads turned toward him. The man was District Attorney Brian Whitaker, and the look in his eyes said one thing: this was about to get a whole lot worse. Hours earlier, it had started like any other day. The city of Atlanta was alive with the morning rush. People hurried down the sidewalks, coffee in one hand, phones in the other. Judge Olivia Carter sat in her car, sipping a warm cup of tea as she listened to the news. And in other headlines, Officer Richard Doyle is under investigation after video footage surfaced of him forcefully arresting a young black man outside a convenience store last night. Olivia exhaled slowly, shaking her head. Another day, another case of police misconduct, but this one was different. She had seen the footage herself. A 19-year-old college student named Malik Johnson had been stopped outside a store. The security camera caught everything: Doyle approaching him, pushing him against the wall, throwing him to the ground. Malik hadn't resisted. He had barely spoken. And yet, Doyle had pinned him down, knee on his back, pressing so hard that the boy gasped for air. And then, Olivia had seen something that made her blood run cold. Doyle had smirked. It wasn't fear. It wasn't adrenaline. It was pure, twisted enjoyment. Now, Olivia was not the type to let things slide. She had worked her way up the judicial system, fighting tooth and nail against the very people who believed they were above the law. She had ruled on difficult cases before, but this one This one was personal. She had called an emergency hearing. And by noon, Doyle was standing in her courtroom, completely unfazed. Until now, back in the courtroom, Olivia could see the muscles in Brian Whitaker's jaw tighten as he stepped forward. The district attorney was a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. "Your Honor," Brian said, his voice firm, "I need to speak with you privately." Doyle, still struggling against his handcuffs, scoffed. "Yeah, you do that. Maybe you can talk some sense into this woman." Marcus yanked the cuffs tighter. Judge Carter clenched her jaw but kept her composure. "D. Whitaker, whatever you need to say, you can say it here." Brian hesitated for a moment before sighing. He glanced at Doyle, then back at the judge. "There's something you don't know," he said. The room grew even quieter, if that was possible. Judge Carter folded her arms. "Then enlighten me." Brian took a deep breath. "There are people who don't want this case to go forward," he said slowly. "Powerful people." Olivia's eyes narrowed. "People in the police department?" she asked. Brian didn't respond. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said it all. Doyle smirked again, his confidence returning. "Told you," he muttered under his breath. Judge Carter's hands curled into fists. She wasn't afraid of powerful people. She was a powerful person. But before she could respond, there was a loud bang from outside the courtroom. Then, screams. The bailiff turned toward the door, his hand moving toward his weapon. The courtroom doors swung open again. And this time, a man in a black ski mask rushed inside, gun in hand, and he was pointing it directly at Judge Carter. The moment the masked man stepped into the courtroom, everything slowed down. Judge Olivia Carter locked eyes with him, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. The man's grip on the gun was tight, steady. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't panicked. He was prepared. "Everybody stay where you are," he barked. His voice was deep, raspy. "Nobody moves and nobody dies." The air turned electric with fear. The stenographer let out a small whimper. The jury, still seated in their box, sat frozen, their faces pale. Some people ducked beneath the benches, trembling. Marcus, the bailiff, instinctively moved toward his gun, but the masked man caught it. "Don't even think about it," he snapped, pointing the weapon at Marcus's chest. Marcus froze, his fingers inches from his holster. Doyle, still handcuffed, took a small step back, his usual arrogance flickering into uncertainty. And then, the gunman turned his weapon back to Olivia. "Judge Carter," he said, his voice suddenly eerily calm. "We need to have a little chat." Olivia's spine stiffened, but she kept her face composed. She had faced powerful men before. She had stood before murderers, rapists, and criminals who thought they were invincible. But this was something new. "Who sent you?" she asked, her voice strong and steady. The man chuckled. "That's not how this works, Judge." He took a step closer. "What's about to happen next? That depends on you." Marcus tensed. "You don't have to do this, man," he said, his voice even. "This is a courthouse. You're making things worse for yourself." The gunman didn't even glance at him. His attention was locked on Olivia. "You see," he continued, "there are people who don't want this case to go any further. And those people, they have resources." Judge Carter's jaw tightened. "I don't respond to threats," she said firmly. The gunman tilted his head. "This isn't a threat, ma'am. It's a warning." At that moment, the door behind the judge's bench creaked open slightly. A second bailiff, a young woman named Denise, peeked in. She had heard the commotion and had a hand on her radio. The gunman's eyes flickered toward the movement, and that was all Marcus needed. With lightning speed, Marcus lunged forward. Bang! A gunshot rang out. Screams exploded in the courtroom. Denise ducked for cover, fumbling for her weapon. The stenographer sobbed. Several jurors scrambled over each other, trying to hide. Marcus grunted, stumbling back. Blood seeped through his shirt. He had been hit, but even wounded, he didn't stop. With one last burst of strength, he grabbed the gunman's wrist and twisted it. Crack! The gun tumbled to the floor. The gunman cursed, swinging a fist, but he never got the chance. Olivia, seizing the moment, grabbed her gavel and slammed it against the man's head with everything she had. The masked man staggered, disoriented. That was all the opening Marcus needed. Ignoring the pain in his side, the bailiff tackled the gunman to the ground. Within seconds, Denise rushed in, pinning the man's arms while two officers stormed the courtroom. "Gun down! Gun down!" one of them shouted. The gunman struggled, but it was over. Handcuffs snapped around his wrists. The courtroom was still shaking with fear, but one thing was clear. Judge Olivia Carter was still standing. 30 minutes later, Olivia sat in her chambers, her hands resting on the wooden desk. The adrenaline was still coursing through her veins, but her mind was already processing the bigger picture. Brian Whitaker stood across from her, his face pale with tension. "This wasn't random," Olivia said, her voice low. "This was a message." Brian exhaled slowly, running a hand through his short brown hair. "I know." She narrowed her eyes at him. "And I need you to tell me exactly what's going on." Brian hesitated for a long moment. Then, finally, "There's a cover-up happening in the police department," he admitted. Olivia felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. Brian leaned in. "Doyle? He's not just another dirty cop. He's part of something bigger." Olivia's fingers curled into fists. "How big?" Brian swallowed. "Let's just say, if you don't handle this carefully, you won't be dealing with just one rogue officer." She raised an eyebrow. "Then who else am I dealing with?" Brian took a deep breath. The entire Blue Shield. A heavy silence filled the room. Olivia's heart pounded. She had heard whispers about it before. A secret network within the police force. Officers who protected each other at any cost. Corrupt cops, powerful people, all working together. And if Brian was right, that meant Doyle wasn't the only threat. "Judge Carter," Brian said, lowering his voice, "I need you to drop this case." Olivia stiffened. "You expect me to let Doyle walk free?" Brian's expression darkened. "I expect you to stay alive." She stood up. "I won't be intimidated." Brian sighed. "Then you're already in more danger than you realize." Before Olivia could respond, there was a knock at the door. Denise stepped inside, her face tense. "Your Honor, we have a problem." Olivia's pulse quickened. "What now?" Denise licked her lips nervously. "The masked man," she said. "We took him into custody. Put him in holding." "And?" Olivia prompted. Denise's next words sent a chill down Olivia's spine. "He's dead." Judge Carter's stomach dropped. "What?" she whispered. Denise swallowed hard. "We had him in a secure cell. No one went in. No one went out." She hesitated. "And yet, someone got to him." A cold shiver ran down Olivia's back. The gunman hadn't been there to kill her. He had been there to deliver a message. And now, whoever sent him had just silenced him for good. Brian met Olivia's eyes. "This isn't just about Doyle anymore," he said grimly. A slow realization settled over Olivia. She had stepped into something much bigger than one racist cop. And now, someone wanted her dead. The weight of Denise's words hung heavy in the air. "He's dead." Judge Olivia Carter barely moved, barely breathed. The masked gunman, the only person who could have told them who sent him, was gone. Brian Whitaker's expression was grave. He rubbed his jaw, his mind clearly racing. Marcus, who had just received medical treatment for his wound, stood near the door. His shirt was blood-stained, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "Do we have surveillance footage?" Olivia asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Denise shifted uncomfortably. "That's the thing, Your Honor. The cameras in the holding area cut out 20 minutes ago." Silence. Brian cursed under his breath. This wasn't some random attack. This was precision. Someone with inside access. Olivia's mind was working fast now. Someone had taken a huge risk by sending an armed man into a courtroom. And when that failed, they had him eliminated before he could talk. That meant one thing. Whoever they weren't just powerful. They were desperate. She met Brian's gaze. "We need to move fast." Brian nodded. "Agreed. But before we do anything, we need to figure out who we can trust." 30 minutes later, Olivia, Brian, Marcus, and Denise gathered in the judge's private chambers. Brian pulled out his laptop and opened a secure folder. "Let me show you something," he said, turning the screen toward Olivia. She leaned in. A series of reports popped up on the screen. Arrest records, incident reports, complaints, and one name appeared again and again. Officer Richard Doyle. She scanned the reports, her stomach tightening. Use of excessive force, falsifying evidence, coercing witnesses, connections to disappearing informants. Yet, every single case against him had been dropped. I knew Doyle was dirty, Olivia murmured, her jaw tightening. But this is next level. Brian nodded grimly. Because he's protected, and not just by a few rogue officers. Doyle is part of an organized network. Marcus leaned forward. The blue shield? Brian exhaled. Yeah. He scrolled down. It's an internal fraternity of officers who operate above the law. They cover up each other's crimes, intimidate witnesses, and eliminate threats. And the worst part? He looked Olivia straight in the eye. They have friends everywhere. The police department, City Hall, even the courts. A cold shiver ran down Olivia's spine. That meant someone inside the system was working against her. Denise frowned. But if that's true, why go after you so publicly? Why not just make you disappear quietly? Olivia thought for a moment, then realization struck her. They wanted me to back down, she said. They thought scaring me would be enough. Brian folded his arms. But you didn't. Olivia met his gaze. And now they're done playing games. That night, Olivia sat in her car outside her home, gripping the steering wheel. She had been threatened before. She had received hate mail, angry calls, even veiled threats in court. But this was different. This was real. Her fingers hovered over her phone. She thought about calling someone. Her brother in Chicago, maybe even her father. But what would she say? Hey, just a heads up, powerful people might want me dead. She closed her eyes, taking a slow breath. She had always known the justice system was flawed. She had fought to fix it, to hold people like Doyle accountable. And now, that fight had led her here. She finally stepped out of the car, glancing around. The street was quiet. Too quiet. A prickling sensation crept down her spine. She had lived in this house for years, and she knew when something felt off. She turned to lock her car when a shadow moved. Fast. From the corner of her eye. Her heart slammed in her chest. She whipped around, scanning the street. Nothing. But the feeling wouldn't leave. Her pulse quickened. She wasn't alone. Carefully, she reached into her purse, wrapping her fingers around the small can of mace she always carried. Step by step, she moved toward her front door. She pressed her key into the lock, and then, a voice. Low. Chilling. You should have walked away. Olivia barely had time to react before a rough hand grabbed her from behind. A gloved hand clamped over her mouth. Her scream was muffled. She kicked, struggled, thrashed, but whoever it was strong. They pulled her back, dragging her toward the darkness. The last thing she saw was the faint glow of a streetlight. And then, everything went black. Darkness. Thick. Suffocating. Endless. Judge Olivia Carter's mind was swimming between consciousness and unconsciousness. Her body felt heavy, like she was sinking into the depths of the ocean. Her ears rang. Her head pounded. Then, a sharp sting on her cheek. Slap. Her eyes snapped open. Blinding light. She gasped, sucking in air. She was alive. But she wasn't safe. Her wrists were bound behind her. Her ankles tied to the legs of a chair. A damp rag stuffed into her mouth. She wasn't in her home anymore. The dim, flickering light above her revealed a concrete floor. Exposed pipes. A musty smell in the air. A basement. Footsteps echoed around her. She blinked rapidly, trying to focus. A man stood before her, his face hidden by a black ski mask. He was big, his presence dominating the room. Her breathing was shallow, but her mind was sharp. Stay calm. Observe. Think. The man let out a low chuckle. You woke up faster than I expected, Judge. His voice was familiar. Too familiar. Olivia narrowed her eyes. He crouched in front of her, gripping the arms of her chair. I need you to understand something. This isn't personal. She glared at him. Oh, wait, he smirked. Actually, it is. He ripped the gag from her mouth. Olivia inhaled sharply, then spat the first words that came to her lips. Cowards wear masks. His smirk twitched. He grabbed her jaw, squeezing hard. You think you're tough, huh? His grip tightened. You think that robe makes you untouchable? She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Who sent you? She demanded. The man tilted his head. Oh, Judge. You already know the answer to that. She did. The Blue Shield. But what she didn't know was, how far were they willing to go? She glanced around the room, scanning for exits, weapons, weaknesses. The man noticed and laughed. Don't bother. There's no way out of here. Olivia clenched her jaw. I'll be straight with you, the man continued. You're causing problems. You should have taken the hint after the courtroom stunt. She didn't respond. He grabbed a chair, flipped it around, and sat on it, arms resting on the back. See, we don't usually take things this far. But you? His eyes darkened. You don't listen. Olivia's heart pounded, but her face remained unreadable. You have two options, he said casually. Option 1, you drop the Doyle case. Make some excuse. Call it a lack of evidence. We walk away. You live your life. And option 2, she asked. The man smiled. We make you disappear. Silence. A deadly silence. Olivia's pulse thrummed in her ears. Then, she laughed. The man's smirk faltered. What's so funny? Olivia leaned forward as much as the restraints allowed. If you were going to kill me, I'd already be dead. His jaw clenched. Your bosses don't want a murder investigation on their hands, she continued. Especially not a judge's murder. His nostrils flared. Don't test me, lady. She smirked. Oh, I'm not testing you. I'm calling your bluff. A beat of silence. Then, the man lunged forward and wrapped his hands around her throat. Olivia didn't panic. She stayed still, calculated. He wanted a reaction. Fear. Desperation. She refused to give him either. His grip tightened, but not enough to kill her. Just enough to make her feel powerless. But Olivia Carter was never powerless. She met his eyes and whispered, You're just another weak man hiding behind a badge. Something in his face snapped. He released her throat and stormed away, fists clenched. For the first time, she saw it. He was shaken. Whoever this man was, he wasn't the one calling the shots. He was following orders. And Olivia just found his weakness. Meanwhile, Brian Whitaker paced inside the Atlanta Police Department, his phone pressed to his ear. Ring, ring, ring. Come on, Olivia, he muttered. Pick up. Nothing. His gut twisted. Something was wrong. He turned to Marcus, who was still wincing from his injury but alert. She hasn't answered for hours. Marcus' expression darkened. That's not like her. Brian gritted his teeth. We need to move. Denise approached them, urgency in her step. Guys, I pulled the street cam footage outside Judge Carter's house. Brian and Marcus huddled around her phone screen. Denise pressed play. The grainy black and white footage showed Olivia stepping out of her car. Then, a dark figure emerging from the shadows. A struggle. And then, she was gone. Marcus slammed his fist against the table. Damn it. Brian's face went pale. The Blue Shield had her. And if they didn't move fast, she wouldn't make it out alive. Back in the basement, the masked man returned, his expression cold. We're done playing, he muttered. He pulled a knife from his belt. Olivia inhaled deeply, keeping her face calm. He twirled the blade between his fingers. Last chance, Judge. Say the words. She lifted her chin. No. His nostrils flared. I don't negotiate with cowards, she said. His fingers tightened around the knife. And then, a loud bang erupted from upstairs. Yelling. Gunfire. The masked man stiffened. What the hell? Before he could react, the door burst open. A figure charged inside. Marcus. A gunshot rang out. The masked man dropped. And Olivia was free. The gunshot still rang in the air. The masked man slumped against the concrete floor, his body twitching before going still. Blood pooled beneath him, the knife slipping from his fingers. Judge Olivia Carter's breath came in sharp gasps as she stared at the scene before her. Marcus, his gun still raised, eyes blazing, had just saved her life. Behind him, Brian Whitaker stormed into the basement, his own weapon drawn. Denise followed, scanning the space quickly before locking eyes with Olivia. Judge. Denise rushed forward, immediately untying the ropes from Olivia's wrists and ankles. Olivia's muscles screamed in pain as she was freed, but she didn't complain. She was alive. She swallowed hard, looking at Marcus. You found me. Marcus, still breathing heavily, lowered his gun. Yeah, and just in time, too. Brian knelt beside the dead man, pulling off the ski mask. A collective silence fell over the room. They all recognized him. Detective Paul Grayson, a longtime member of the force. Respected, decorated, and now, a confirmed traitor. Brian cursed under his breath. So it's worse than we thought. Marcus nodded grimly. They sent one of their own. Denise let out a slow breath. This was a direct hit. Olivia flexed her sore fingers. And they failed. Her voice was firm, strong. Brian met her gaze. Which means they'll try again. Olivia's jaw tightened. Let them. 20 minutes later, they were outside. The building Olivia had been held in was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Atlanta. A perfect place for someone to disappear. She shivered slightly in the cool night air, exhaustion beginning to settle in. But she refused to show weakness. Brian checked his phone. We need to move. If Doyle and the Blue Shield find out what happened here, we'll be their next targets. Olivia turned to him. So what's next? Brian hesitated. Then, finally, he said, we go on the offensive. She narrowed her eyes. Meaning? Marcus stepped forward. Meaning it's time to expose them. Denise nodded. We take this to the public. We show everyone what Doyle and his network have been hiding. Olivia exhaled slowly. That's a dangerous game. Brian looked her in the eye. So is staying silent. She knew he was right. They had been reacting this whole time, dodging threats, surviving attacks. But now, it was their turn to strike first. Olivia's eyes darkened with determination. Then let's burn them to the ground. A few hours later, the four of them gathered at Brian's office. The walls were covered in case files, police reports, and surveillance stills. Every document linked back to one central figure, Officer Richard Doyle. Denise pulled up a video file on her laptop. We found something. She clicked play. Grainy footage appeared. Security camera footage from a police locker room. Doyle stood with 3 other officers, their voices barely audible. But the words were clear. Judge Carter is a problem. Needs to be dealt with before she gets too deep. We have people who can handle this. Olivia's blood ran cold. This was evidence. Hard proof that Doyle and his men were actively plotting against her. Brian's face was unreadable. This is what we needed. Marcus folded his arms. Now what? Olivia took a deep breath. Then, without hesitation, she said, we leak it. Denise's eyebrows raised. To who? Olivia's answer was immediate. To everyone. The next morning, chaos erupted. The leaked footage went viral. Social media exploded. News stations picked it up within hours. The headlines were everywhere. Corrupt Atlanta cops caught plotting against Judd. Blue Shield exposed. Secret network of officers under investigation. Judge Carter breaks silence, demands action. Within hours, the city was on fire. Protests broke out. People demanded justice. The police department scrambled to contain the fallout. And Richard Doyle? He was nowhere to be found. That evening, Olivia sat in her office, staring at the news coverage. Her phone buzzed. A blocked number. She hesitated, then answered. A deep voice came through the line. You think this is over? A chill ran down her spine. You just started a war. Then, the line went dead. Olivia stared at the phone. Her hands curled into fists. She didn't back down in court. She didn't back down when they kidnapped her. And she sure as hell wasn't backing down now. She set the phone down, her eyes burning with resolve. This wasn't over. Not even close. The city was in chaos. Judge Olivia Carter watched from her office window as the streets of Atlanta pulsed with protesters. Hundreds, maybe thousands, of people had gathered outside the courthouse, chanting for justice. No more cover-ups. Doyle must go. We stand with Judge Carter. The Blue Shield had ruled from the shadows for years, silencing those who spoke against them. But now, Their crimes were in the light for all to see. Olivia's phone buzzed again. Another blocked number. She hesitated before answering. A voice came through the line, deep and composed. Too composed. I warned you. Olivia's grip tightened on the phone. You think leaking that video changes anything? The voice continued. All it did was put a target on your back. You think the protests will save you? Her jaw clenched. Who is this? The man chuckled. You already know. Her blood turned to ice. Doyle. Silence. Then, a slow, mocking clap. Smart woman. Too bad you won't be smart enough to survive what's coming next. The line went dead. Olivia exhaled, setting the phone down. She turned to Brian, Marcus, and Denise, who had been watching her closely. Marcus' fists were clenched. It was him, wasn't it? She nodded. Brian stepped forward. What did he say? Olivia's expression was cold, calculated. That we started a war. Denise let out a slow breath. Then we better be ready to finish it. That night, Olivia didn't go home. None of them did. They knew Doyle was still out there, hiding, watching, planning his next move. So they made one of their own. Brian's office had become their war room. The walls were covered in case files, police reports, and surveillance stills. And now, there was a new picture pinned to the center. Captain Howard Reynolds, a high-ranking officer in the Atlanta PD. A man with too many connections to Doyle and the Blue Shield. We need him, Brian said. He's the key. Olivia folded her arms. You think he'll talk? Brian's expression was grim. If we push hard enough, he won't have a choice. Marcus leaned in. Then let's push. The next morning, they went after Reynolds. A subpoena was issued, forcing him to appear before a closed-door hearing. No cameras. No press. Just the truth. Reynolds sat at the table, his hands folded. A man in his 50s, his graying hair neatly combed, his badge shining. But his eyes betrayed him. He was nervous. Brian leaned forward. Captain Reynolds, do you deny knowing about the Blue Shield? Reynolds didn't blink. I don't know what you're talking about. Marcus scoffed. Come on, man. You've been covering for Doyle for years. Reynolds' jaw tightened. I served the city of Atlanta with honor. I won't sit here and be accused of. Olivia cut him off. Then explain this. She slid a manila folder across the table. Inside? Bank records. Deposits. Withdrawals. Large cash payments deposited into Reynolds' account, each one aligning with major incidents involving Doyle. Reynolds' face went pale. Brian's voice was calm, but firm. You were paid to look the other way. Paid to cover up misconduct. Paid to protect Doyle. Reynolds swallowed hard. Olivia leaned in. Who else is involved? Reynolds hesitated. Then, finally, his eyes flickered to the door, like he was waiting for someone. A cold realization settled over Olivia. This wasn't a testimony. This was a trap. Before she could react, bang, bang, gunshots exploded in the hallway. Screams. Chaos. Denise drew her weapon. Down. The doors burst open. Masked gunmen stormed the room, weapons raised. Reynolds bolted, shoving the table over and making a run for the back exit. Marcus fired, hitting one of the gunmen in the shoulder. Brian tackled Olivia to the ground, shielding her from the bullets. Move. Move. Marcus shouted. Denise returned fire, dropping another attacker. Reynolds was almost at the door, but before he could escape, a third gunman stepped in front of him. Richard Doyle. Olivia's heart stopped. Doyle raised his gun. Bang. Reynolds collapsed, blood pouring from his chest. Doyle grinned. Can't have him talking. Now can we? Then, his gun turned toward Olivia. Your turn, Judge. Brian lunged, but Doyle fired first. Bang. Brian crashed to the floor, blood pooling from his shoulder. Olivia's world tilted. Doyle stepped forward, his gun aimed straight at her head. You should have taken the deal. Marcus tried to raise his weapon. Click. Out of ammo. Denise moved, but too slow. Doyle smirked. He pulled the trigger. Bang. 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 Doyle staggered, his face twisting in confusion. His gun slipped from his fingers. He dropped to his knees. And behind him, a figure holding a smoking gun. Marcus blinked. What the? Olivia's breath hitched, because standing behind Doyle, gun still raised, was a police officer. But not just any officer. A man in full uniform. Lieutenant James Holloway, one of the highest-ranking officers in the department. And the look in his eyes? It wasn't relief. It wasn't fear. It was anger. Doyle coughed, blood dripping from his mouth. He looked up at Holloway, betrayal in his eyes. "You," he gasped. Holloway's voice was ice. "You were always sloppy, Doyle." Doyle's head slumped forward. He was dead. The gunfire had stopped. The room was silent. Olivia stared at Holloway, her breath uneven. "Why?" she asked. Holloway's jaw clenched. "Because I hate dirty cops." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Olivia with more questions than answers. The room was still. Richard Doyle lay motionless on the floor, his lifeless eyes staring at nothing. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the cheap office carpet. Lieutenant James Holloway holstered his weapon, his expression unreadable. Olivia Carter's heart was still racing, her mind struggling to keep up. "Why?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Holloway turned his sharp gaze on her. "Because men like Doyle give this badge a bad name." That wasn't an answer. That was an excuse. Brian groaned from the floor, clutching his wounded shoulder. Denise was already kneeling beside him, applying pressure to stop the bleeding. Marcus hadn't moved, his gun still pointed at Holloway. "You expect us to believe you just walked in here and decided to clean up the mess?" Holloway didn't flinch. "Believe what you want." Olivia straightened, her instinct screaming that something was off. "How did you know we were here?" Holloway held her gaze. "I didn't." She didn't believe him. The timing was too perfect. The shot placement was too precise. And the way Doyle had looked at him before he died, that wasn't shock. That was betrayal. Holloway had been involved in this from the beginning. But now? Now, he was tying up loose ends. Before Olivia could press further, the distant wail of sirens grew louder. Marcus exchanged a glance with her. More cops are coming, and they had no idea who they could trust. Holloway turned toward the door. "You need to leave. Now." Denise looked up. "You expect us to just walk out of here like nothing happened?" Holloway exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Listen, I just put a bullet in Doyle. That means every dirty cop who worked with him is gonna come looking for me and you. If you stay here, you'll be dead before sunrise." Olivia narrowed her eyes. "And what about you?" His jaw tightened. "I'll handle it." That wasn't good enough. But Olivia didn't have time to argue. Brian gritted his teeth. "We can't stay." Marcus nodded. "Let's go." Olivia hesitated. Then, finally, she turned and ran. They drove in silence. Denise was behind the wheel, hands gripping the steering tightly. Brian sat in the passenger seat, pale from blood loss but still conscious. Marcus and Olivia were in the back, watching the city lights blur past. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. "We should have killed Holloway when we had the chance." Olivia sighed. "He's not our biggest threat right now." Marcus scoffed. "You really believe that?" "No," Olivia admitted. "But if we killed him, we'd be just like them." Marcus muttered something under his breath, but didn't argue. Brian shifted slightly, wincing in pain. "We need to figure out our next move." Olivia already knew what that was. "We need evidence," she said. "More than just leaked footage. We need something undeniable." Denise frowned. "Like what?" Olivia met her gaze. "We need to find the money." The next morning, they had holed up in a safe house, a small, abandoned office space that Brian owned. It wasn't much, but it was off the grid. Denise had hacked into police financial records, searching for any trace of off-the-books payments linked to the Blue Shield. Marcus had secured weapons. Brian was recovering. And Olivia? She was waiting, because she knew something that none of them wanted to say out loud. Killing Doyle didn't end this. It only made things worse. The Blue Shield wasn't just a group. It was a system. And when you cut off the head of a snake, the body didn't die. It just grew another head. And that head was coming for her next. Her phone buzzed. A new message. From an unknown number. Check the news. A lump formed in Olivia's throat. She opened a browser. And what she saw made her blood run cold. Breaking news. Judge Olivia Carter under investigation for bribery and corruption. She barely had time to react before another notification popped up. Warrant issued for the arrest of Judge Carter. Her heart stopped. Brian, still groggy, sat up. What is it? Olivia turned the phone toward him. Marcus cursed. Denise's face paled. This is a setup, Marcus growled. Olivia's grip tightened on the phone. The Blue Shield wasn't just coming after her physically. They were coming after her legally. They were destroying her life. Brian exhaled sharply. We need to get ahead of this. Denise's fingers flew across the keyboard. I can try to track where the accusations came from, but if they already pushed this through the DA's office, we're screwed. Marcus looked at Olivia. We need to run. She clenched her fists. No. Marcus blinked. What? I'm not running, she said, steel in her voice. That's exactly what they want. Marcus sighed. Then what's your plan? Olivia met his gaze. We go to the one place they won't expect. Brian frowned. Which is? Olivia inhaled deeply. The mayor's office. Silence. Then, Denise whistled. Damn, that's bold. Marcus folded his arms. You think the mayor's gonna help us? I think, Olivia said, that the mayor doesn't like being played. She picked up her coat. They had one shot at this, and she wasn't about to waste it. Because the Blue Shield had made one fatal mistake. They had tried to bury her too soon. And now? She was going to burn them to the ground. The tension inside the car was thick as Olivia Carter, Brian, Marcus, and Denise drove toward Atlanta City Hall. Every street they passed was lined with police, patrol cars, officers on foot, their eyes scanning the streets for her. Because Olivia Carter wasn't just a judge anymore. She was now a fugitive. Brian adjusted the sling on his wounded shoulder, wincing. This is insane. You know that, right? Olivia didn't flinch. We don't have a choice. Denise, driving with one hand and scanning her laptop with the other, exhaled. The news cycle is completely controlled right now. Every major station is reporting the bribery scandal like it's fact. Marcus frowned. Whoever's pulling the strings, they're fast. Olivia already knew the answer. Holloway. She clenched her jaw. Doyle had been reckless, sloppy, but Holloway? He was calculated, a true strategist, and he had set her up perfectly, which meant she had one shot to turn the tables. And that meant Mayor Daniel Foster. The plan was dangerous. It relied on speed, deception, and most importantly, the element of surprise. Denise hacked the security system of City Hall, looping camera footage to buy them a few minutes. Marcus, disguised in an old maintenance worker uniform, slipped through a back entrance, disabling the alarm on the emergency stairwell. Brian and Olivia entered through the front, wearing hoodies pulled low. They blended into the crowd of government employees coming in for the day. Everywhere they looked, wanted posters with Olivia's face. Marcus' voice crackled in Olivia's earpiece. You're clear. Go. Now. They slipped into a service elevator. Brian hit the button for the top floor. As the doors closed, he exhaled. This is either going to be brilliant or get us all killed. Olivia didn't hesitate. Then let's make sure it's brilliant. The elevator doors dinged open to reveal the mayor's office lobby. 2 security guards, armed, watching everyone closely. Denise's voice crackled in Olivia's earpiece. Okay, I'm patching into the security system. I can kill the alarms, but I can't stop the guards. Brian sighed. Figures. Olivia squared her shoulders. Then we do this the hard way. She marched forward, hood off, walking with purpose. The guards immediately tensed. Hey, stop right there. She raised her hands. Judge Olivia Carter. Here to see the mayor. The guards exchanged a look. One reached for his radio. This is Unit 4. We have a suspect matching Judge Carter's description on the mayor's floor. Requesting immediate backup. Before he could finish, Marcus stormed in from the stairwell and punched the guy in the throat. The second guard reached for his weapon, but Brian grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall, slamming it into his head. Both guards went down. Denise's voice came through the earpiece. You guys are insane. Security's gonna be swarming that floor in 5 minutes. Then we need less than 5, Olivia muttered, pushing open the mayor's door. Mayor Daniel Foster was a man in his mid-50s, tall, with silver-streaked hair and a perpetually tired expression. And right now, he looked completely stunned. "Judge Carter?" Foster shot to his feet. "What the hell are you doing here?" Olivia didn't waste a second. She slammed a thick manila folder onto his desk. "I need you to look at that. Right now." Foster stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "There's an arrest warrant out for you. Do you have any idea?" "Look at the damn file, Daniel." Her voice was sharp, commanding. Foster hesitated, then grabbed the folder and flipped it open. Inside, bank statements, bribes, blackmail files, everything they had on the Blue Shield. And at the top of the list, Lieutenant James Holloway. Foster's face paled as he flipped through the pages. "My God," he muttered. "Holloway's been running this from the inside?" Olivia leaned in. "He's setting me up. He's covering his tracks. And if you don't help me, he's gonna get away with it." Foster ran a hand over his face, clearly overwhelmed. This is bad. If this leaks, it could bring down half the department." Olivia's voice was cold. "That's the point." Foster hesitated. "I can't." She slammed her palm on his desk. "Daniel, you think they'll stop at me? You think they won't come for you next?" Foster swallowed. For a long moment, the room was silent. Then, slowly, he exhaled and picked up his phone. "Give me 30 minutes, he said. "If you're right, we'll take Holloway down." Olivia nodded. "Then you better move fast." Because she could feel it. Somewhere in the city, Holloway was already making his next move. And time was running out. 30 minutes later, the first news alert hit the airwaves. Breaking news. Massive police corruption scandal rocks Atlanta PD. And then, another. Lieutenant James Holloway under federal investigation. And then, an arrest warrant issued for Holloway. The dominoes were falling. But something still felt wrong. Olivia's phone buzzed. A text message. From an unknown number. She opened it, and her stomach dropped. It was a picture. A live feed from a security camera. Of Marcus, bound to a chair. A gun pressed to his temple. Then, a second text. "Come alone, Judge, or he dies." Her blood turned ice cold. Brian and Denise saw the message at the same time. Brian's face darkened. "No. No way. This is a trap." Denise's hands shook. "They took him?" Olivia didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat. Brian caught her arm. "Olivia." Her voice was pure steel. "I started this war." She yanked free. "Now I'm going to end it." And with that, she walked out the door, straight into the lion's den. The city lights blurred as Judge Olivia Carter drove through the streets of Atlanta, her mind locked in one singular thought. Marcus. They had him. And now, she was walking straight into the trap. The GPS coordinates from the text led her to an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. Rusted metal, broken windows, a place where bodies disappeared. She killed the engine, gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. Her gun sat on the passenger seat. One clip, no backup. She wasn't naive. She knew Holloway wasn't planning to let her walk away from this. But she also knew one thing for sure. They were not leaving with Marcus. She grabbed the gun, checked the chamber, and stepped out into the cold night air. Somewhere in the distance, a train rumbled by, the tracks vibrating beneath her feet. A single light flickered near the factory entrance. She walked toward it, and the doors creaked open. Inside was dark, except for a single overhead lamp swinging from a rusted chain. And under that lamp, Marcus, tied to a chair, bruised, blood on his lip, and standing beside him, James Holloway. His uniform was gone. Instead, he wore a black tactical jacket, gun holstered on his hip. His expression was calm, too calm. Olivia's footsteps echoed as she approached. Holloway smirked. "You actually came alone." She didn't respond. She was too busy taking in the scene. For other men stood in the shadows, all armed. And Marcus? Still breathing. Still conscious. Good. Holloway crossed his arms. "You've been busy, Judge. Ruining careers. Destroying reputations. Getting good cops killed." Olivia's jaw clenched. Doyle was never a good cop. Holloway's smirk faded. "No," he admitted. "He was reckless. and reckless men get sloppy. He glanced down at Marcus, then back at Olivia. Which brings us to you. Olivia stared him down. What do you want? Holloway tilted his head. To offer you a way out. She laughed coldly. That's funny. You don't strike me as a man who gives second chances. His eyes darkened. I don't. He stepped closer. But I'm a businessman. And right now, you're bad for business. Silence. Then, he continued. The Blue Shield was never about corruption. It's about control. Order. Keeping the system working how it should. But you? His lips curled. You disrupted that. You put a spotlight on things that should have stayed in the dark. Olivia's voice was ice. Like murder? Bribery? Cover-ups? Holloway sighed. Like keeping powerful people in power. Another pause. Then, he pulled a manila folder from his jacket and tossed it at her feet. She frowned. Go ahead, he said. Take a look. She bent down, keeping one eye on him as she picked it up. She flipped it open and felt her stomach drop. Inside were pictures. Surveillance photos of her. Brian, Denise, Marcus. Their homes. Their families. Every move they had made in the last month. Holloway chuckled. You thought you were in control of this fight, Judge? He leaned in. You were never in control. We've been watching you since day one. Olivia's fingers curled around the edge of the folder. Holloway continued. So here's the deal. He gestured to Marcus. Walk away. Let this go. Make a public statement that the leaked footage was fake. Say the investigation was a misunderstanding. His voice turned sharp. And you all live. A slow breath left Olivia's lips. And if I say no? Holloway's expression didn't change. He simply pulled his gun and pointed it at Marcus' head. Olivia's pulse pounded. Marcus swallowed hard, but his eyes met hers. And in that moment, she knew. He was ready to die for this. Holloway's finger rested on the trigger. Decide. Now. Olivia's grip tightened on the gun in her coat pocket. She had seconds to act. Seconds to make a choice. Then, she did. Bang. The room erupted in chaos. Holloway stumbled back, blood blooming on his shoulder. The gunshot was hers. She had fired first. Marcus threw his chair backward, knocking one of the armed men off balance. Olivia dove behind a metal crate as gunfire exploded around her. Pop, pop, pop. Sparks flew as bullets ricocheted off rusted beams. Marcus, still bound, kicked hard, knocking his captor to the ground. Olivia fired again, hitting another man in the leg. Holloway cursed, gripping his wound. Kill her. One of his men charged forward. But before he could reach Olivia, bang, bang, gunshots from the entrance. Denise and Brian stormed inside. Brian, still wounded but deadly, took out a second man. Denise's gunfire ripped through the air, dropping a third. The last remaining thug fled, disappearing into the shadows. Holloway was on his knees, bleeding, panting. Marcus, now freed from his restraints, stood over him, breathing heavy, gun in hand. The room was silent, except for the distant hum of the city. Holloway smirked despite the pain. You think this changes anything? Olivia stepped forward. It already did. She raised her gun, aiming straight at him. His smile didn't fade. You don't have the guts, he whispered. Her finger twitched over the trigger. He deserved it. After everything, he deserved it. Then, a siren. A distant roar of police vehicles speeding toward the factory. Brian lowered his gun. They're coming. Marcus exhaled, glaring down at Holloway. We can't be here when they do. Olivia's pulse pounded. Then, finally, she lowered her weapon. I'm not like you, she said. And I never will be. Holloway chuckled weakly. We'll see about that. Then, he slumped over. Still alive, but bleeding out. Denise grabbed Olivia's arm. We need to go. Now. Olivia took one last look at Holloway. Then, she turned and walked away. Because the war wasn't over. Not yet. But after tonight, the Blue Shield was crumbling. And she was going to finish the job. The sirens grew louder as Olivia Carter, Brian, Marcus, and Denise slipped into the shadows, vanishing before the first squad cars arrived. Behind them, James Holloway lay bleeding on the factory floor. His empire, the Blue Shield, was crumbling. But Olivia wasn't celebrating. Not yet, because there was one final move to make. The kill shot, and she intended to deliver it. They regrouped at a safe house, an abandoned apartment complex on the edge of town. Brian, despite his injury, paced the room, his face pale but determined. We just put a target on our backs the size of Texas. Marcus, still bruised from his captivity, wiped blood from his lip. Good. He grinned. That means they're scared. Denise typed furiously on her laptop. I'm pulling every file, every hidden report, every dollar they stole. We're not just exposing Holloway. We're bringing the whole damn system down. Olivia sat quietly, absorbing it all. They had done the impossible. They had fought back. And they had won. Almost. Brian exhaled. So, what now? Olivia lifted her gaze. We go all in. And that's exactly what they did. The next morning, at 9 a.m. sharp, Olivia walked into the courthouse. Not as a fugitive, not as a victim, but as a judge. She strode through the halls with purpose, past the reporters, the flashing cameras, the whispers. Because she was about to make history, she entered the main courtroom, where the entire city was watching, and delivered the ruling of a lifetime. Today, I am issuing an emergency federal order, launching a full-scale criminal investigation into the Atlanta Police Department. Gasps. Shock. The courtroom erupted. But she wasn't finished. We have uncovered undeniable evidence of corruption, cover-ups, and systemic abuse within the department. We have found ties between active officers and organized crime, money laundering, and illegal killings. Cameras flashed. This is not a case of a few bad cops. This is a network, one that has infiltrated the very foundation of our city. She met the eyes of the police officials sitting in the crowd. Many of them were shifting uncomfortably, because they knew she was talking about them. Then, she delivered the final blow. As of this moment, I am issuing arrest warrants for over 30 officers linked to the Blue Shield, including Captain Howard Reynolds, Lieutenant James Holloway, and several other high-ranking officials. Boom. The room exploded into chaos. Cops in the back rushed out, some trying to leave before the FBI could arrive. But it was too late, because they were already here. In real time, across every major news station, the takedown began. Officers dragged from their homes. High-ranking officials escorted out in handcuffs. Bank accounts frozen. Records unsealed. And within minutes, the Blue Shield was dead. That night, Olivia stood on her balcony, overlooking the city. It was over. Or at least, this part was. Marcus leaned against the railing beside her. Hell of a day. She chuckled softly. You could say that. He exhaled. We really did it. She nodded. Yeah, we did. A pause. Then, Marcus looked at her. But they'll rebuild, he said quietly. Corruption always does. Olivia's lips pressed together. She knew that. And yet, she turned to him, her expression calm. Steal. Then we'll burn it down again. Because no matter how many systems tried to protect evil, there would always be people like her. People who refused to stay silent. And as long as she drew breath, she would never stop fighting.